But in the absence of open warfare, they recognized only the tests of journalism and not the tests of national security. And my question tonight is whether additional tests should not now be adopted. That question is for you alone to answer. No public official should answer it for you. No governmental plan should impose its restraints against your will. But I would be failing in my duty to the nation in considering all of the responsibilities that we now bear and all of the means at hand to meet those responsibilities if I did not commend this problem to your attention and urge its thoughtful consideration. On many earlier occasions I have said, and your newspapers have constantly said, that these are times that appeal to every citizen's sense of sacrifice and self-discipline. They call out to every citizen to weigh his rights and comforts against his obligations to the common good. I cannot now believe that those citizens who serve in the newspaper business consider themselves exempt from that appeal. I have no intention of establishing a new Office of War Information to govern the flow of news. I am not suggesting any new forms of censorship or new types of security classifications. I have no easy answer to the dilemma that I have posed and would not seek to impose it if I had one. But I am asking the members of the newspaper profession and the industry in this country to re-examine their own responsibilities, to consider the degree and the nature of the present danger, and to heed the duty of self-restraint which that danger imposes upon us all. Every newspaper now asks itself with respect to every story, is it news? All I suggest is that you add the question, is it in the interest of national security? And I hope that every group in America, unions and businessmen and public officials at every level, will ask the same question of their endeavors and subject their actions to this same exacting test. And should the press of America consider and recommend the voluntary assumption of specific new steps or machinery, I can assure you that we will cooperate wholeheartedly with those recommendations.
The excerpt you just heard was from John F. Kennedy's famous 1961 Secret Society speech. In the speech, John F. Kennedy discussed the relationship between government and the press, and how the government has no role in censoring the press or controlling what the press reports. Of course, what the government preaches and what the government actually does are two very different things. Just 13 years later, in 1974, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh would release a bombshell. Huge CIA operation reported in U.S. against anti-war forces and other dissidents in Nixon years. Washington, December 21st. The Central Intelligence Agency directly violated its charter, conducted a massive illegal domestic intelligence operation during the Nixon administration against the anti-war movement and other dissident groups in the United States, according to well-placed government sources. Of course, at the time, Seymour Hersh couldn't prove what he was saying was true, but that would change in 2007 when the CIA declassified documents known as family jewels. May 16, 1973. Memorandum for Executive Secretary CIA Management Committee. Subject, family jewels. The document reveals that the government kept extensive files on people who were part of the anti-war movements from 1950 to 1970. The CIA engaged in surveillance of Washington Post reporter Michael Gittler. The CIA wiretapped the phones of reporters Robert Allen and Paul Scott, and engaged in the wiretapping of reporters Jack Anderson, Britt Hume, Leslie Whitman, and Joseph Spear. Wiretapping of investigative journalists, which was done to determine the sources of leaks of classified information, would be dubbed Project Mockingbird, a precursor to what would become known as Operation Mockingbird after the 1975 Church Committee. As you can see, the accusations made by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh against the Central Intelligence Agency would be proven correct by the 2007 declassification of CIA documents titled Family Jewels. Following the accusations by Hirsch in the early 70s, a special congressional committee was put together to investigate the nefarious activities of American intelligence agencies, including the Central Intelligence Agency. The congressional committee would become to be known as the Church Committee. Foreign and Military Intelligence, Book 1. Select Committee to Governmental Operations. With respect to intelligence activities, United States Senate, together with additional supplemental and separate views, April 26, 1976, U.S. Government Printing Office, led by Frank Church, Idaho Congressman. Pages 181 to 191 review the CIA's covert use of academic and voluntary organizations. The Central Intelligence Agency has long developed clandestine relationships with the American academic community, which range from academics making introductions for intelligence purposes, to intelligence collection while abroad, to academic research and writing where CIA sponsorship is hidden. The agency has funded the activities of American private organizations around the world when those activities supported or could be convinced to support American foreign policy objectives. Until 1967, the agency also maintained covert ties to American foundations in order to pass funds secretly to private groups whose work the CIA supported. This part is important, the private foundations, understanding that foundations like the Rockefeller Foundations are used as CIA fronts. The relationships have varied according to whether made with an institution or an individual, whether the relationship is paid or unpaid, or whether the individuals are writing or aware of CIA involvement. In some cases, covert involvement provided the CIA with little or no operational control of the institutions involved. Funding was primarily a way to enable people to do things they wanted to do. In other cases, influence was exerted. Nor was the nature of these relationships necessarily static. In the case of some individual support, turning into influence, and finally, even to operational use. So the Church Committee found out that the CIA was funding private institutions and individuals within college institutions in order to further their agenda. They used this covert influence to influence labor matters, cultural affairs, and community developments. By fiscal year 1967, for example, over $3 million was budgeted for youth and student programs and $6 million for labor. Most of the funds were transmitted through legitimate or devised foundations, that is, fictitious entities established by the CIA. Notice again how important these foundations are. CIA use of private foundations pre-1967. The use of philanthropic organizations was a convenient way to pass funds in that large amounts could be transferred rapidly and in a form that need not alert unwitting officers of the recipient organizations of their source. In addition, foundation grants bestowed upon the recipient an apparent blessing of the foundation. The funding pattern involved a mixture of bona fide charitable foundations, devised foundations, and funds, frontmen drawn from a list of America's most prominent citizens, and lawyers representing undisclosed clients. The CIA's intrusion into the foundation field in the 1960s can only be described as massive. Excluding grants from the Big Three, the Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie Foundations, of the 700 grants over $10,000 given by 164 other foundations during this period of 1963 to 1966, at least 108 involved partial or complete CIA funding. More importantly, the CIA funding was involved in nearly half of the grants the non-Big Three foundations made during this period in the field of international activities. In the same period, more than one-third of the grants awarded by non-Big Three in the physical, life, and social sciences also involved the CIA. Keep in mind that these numbers, these monetary amounts, are from the 1960s, and they equate to billions of dollars today. A 1966 CIA study explained the use of legitimate foundations was the most effective way of concealing the CIA's hand, as well as reassuring members of funded organizations that the organization was, in fact, supported by private funds. The agency study contended that this technique was particularly effective for democratically run membership organizations, which need to assure their own unwitting members and collaborators, as well as their hostile critics, that they have genuine, respectable, private sources of income. I cannot stress enough the importance of researching the big tax-exempt foundations, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Ford, in understanding American history. And notice that this points out that many of the members who pushed through this social engineering were unwitting members and collaborators. Pages 191 to 201 cover the CIA's covert relationship with the United States media. Pursuing its foreign intelligence mission, the Central Intelligence Agency has used the U.S. media for both the collection of intelligence and for cover, until February 1976, when it announced a new policy toward U.S. media personnel. The CIA maintained a covert relationship with about 50 American journalists or employees of U.S. media organizations. They are part of a network of several hundred foreign individuals around the world who provide intelligence for the CIA and at times attempt to influence foreign opinion through the use of covert propaganda. These individuals provide the CIA with direct access to a large number of foreign newspapers and periodicals, scores of press services and news agencies, radio and television stations, commercial book publishers, and other foreign media outlets. In approaching the subject of the CIA's relationships with the United States media, the Select Committee has been guided by several broad concerns. It has inquired into the covert publication of propaganda in order to assess its domestic impact. It has investigated the nature and purpose of the covert relationship that the CIA maintains with bona fide U.S. journalists. It has examined the use of journalistic cover by CIA agents. It has pursued the difficult issues of domestic fallout from CIA foreign press placements and other propaganda activities. Books and publishing houses. Covert propaganda is the hidden exercise of the power of persuasion. In the world of covert propaganda, book publishing activities have a special place. Well over 1,000 books were produced, subsidized, or sponsored by the CIA before the end of 1967. Approximately 25% of them were written in English. Many of them were published by cultural organizations which the CIA backed, and more often than not, the author was unaware the CIA had subsidized the book. Some books, however, involved direct collaboration between the CIA and the writer. This is a teachable moment. Notice how many of the authors who received subsidies from the CIA weren't aware that the CIA was backing them. But the Central Intelligence Agency had identified those authors as people who would write something that would further the agenda of the CIA at that time. This is how tax-exempt foundations and the CIA, think the Rockefeller Foundation, leverage society. So if you wanted to use science as an example, if the tax-exempt foundations wanted to push a certain type of scientific myth, maybe we could think GMOs or whatever it might be, they only offer grants or subsidies to people that are going to further their agenda, and then they just simply identify these people. And then it looks like to society that there's an overwhelming consensus to one type of science, when in actuality there's not. In 1967 alone, the CIA published or subsidized well over 200 books, ranging from books on wildlife and safaris to translations of Machiavelli's The Prince into Swahili and works of T.S. Eliot into Russian, to a parody of the famous Little Red Book of Quotations from Mao entitled Quotations from Chairman Lao. Covert use of U.S. journalists and media institutions. Of the approximately 50 United States journalists or personnel of U.S. media organizations who were employed by the CIA or maintained some other covert relationship with the CIA at the time of the announcement, fewer than one-half will be terminated under the new CIA guidelines. The CIA claimed that they were going to stop these practices at the time of the Church Committee. I'll let you decide if that's true. About half of the some 50 CIA relationships with the U.S. media were paid relationships, ranging from salaried operatives working under journalistic cover to U.S. journalists serving as independent contractors for the CIA and being paid regularly for their salaries, to those who receive only occasional gifts and reimbursement from the CIA. CIA Director Colby, the director of the CIA at the time, identified 4 types of relationships the CIA had with journalists and U.S. media. Those were U.S. news organizations, U.S. publications, freelance stringers, propaganda writers, and employees of the U.S. publishing houses, journalists with whom the CIA maintains unpaid, occasional covert contact. For example of the damages of fallout involved two proprietary news services that the U.S. maintained in Europe. Today, the CIA's news services might not be proprietary, they just give out $600 million contracts to Amazon and have Jeff Bezos buy the Washington Post. Inevitably, these news services had U.S. subscribers. The larger of the two was subscribed by over 30 U.S. newspapers. In an effort to reduce the problem of fallout, the CIA made a senior official at the major U.S. dailies aware that the CIA controlled these two press services. The report also notes that the CIA was, and presumably still is, well aware that if you control major publications, all the smaller publications around the world will echo whatever is originally reported. Another situation in which the effects of fallout in the United States may be significant is that in which specialized audiences in the United States, area study specialists, for example, may unknowingly heavily rely on materials produced by or subsidized by the CIA. Think of that in terms of the GMO example I gave you earlier. The results of the Church Committee would become known as Operation Mockingbird, as in the media repeats what the government wants, just like a mockingbird. In today's standards, adjusted for inflation, the CIA paid out over $1 billion to private media organizations and journalists in order to push CIA propaganda. The CIA owned its own editorials. They acknowledged that they understood that if they could get a big newspaper to print a story, that like an echo chamber, the rest of the media would print that story without vetting it themselves. Through the use of tax-exempt foundations such as the Rockefeller Foundation, the CIA gave subsidies and grants in order to leverage book writers to write CIA propaganda books. And the CIA attempted to infiltrate universities to impact people at their grassroots level in the areas of journalism and social sciences to push propaganda on the American people. In 1977, Carl Bernstein, co-winner of the 1973 Pulitzer Prize Award for his work in exposing the Watergate scandal, published the results of his investigation into Operation Mockingbird in the Rolling Stones. Among the executives who lent their cooperation to the agency were William Paley of the Columbia Broadcasting System, Henry Luce of Turn Inc., Arthur Hayes Sulzberger of the New York Times, Barry Bingham Sr. of the Louisville Carrier Journal, James Copley of the Copley News Service. Other organizations which cooperated with the CIA included the American Broadcasting Company, the National Broadcasting Company, the Associated Press, United Press International, Reuters, Hearst Newspapers, Scripps Howard, Newsweek Magazine, and Mutual Broadcasting System, the Miami Herald, and the Old Saturday Evening Post, and New York Herald Tribune. By far the most valuable of these associations, according to CIA officials, have been the New York Times, CBS, and Time Inc. Again, they used the big publications to start an echo chamber effect. Think of how the CIA most likely uses the Washington Post today. CIA use of American news media has been much more extensive than the agency officials have acknowledged publicly or in closed sessions with members of Congress. During the 1976 investigation of the CIA by Senate Intelligence Committee, chaired by Senator Frank Church, the dimensions of the agency's involvement with the press became apparent to several members of the panel, as well as 2 or 3 investigators on the staff. But top officials of the CIA, including former directors William Colby and George Bush, persuaded the committee to restrict its inquiry into the matter and to deliberately misrepresent the actual scope of the activities in its final report. The multi-volume report contains 9 pages in which the use of journalists is discussed in deliberately vague and sometimes misleading terms. It makes no mention of the actual number of journalists who undertook covert tasks for the CIA, nor does it adequately describe the role played by newspaper and broadcaster executives in cooperating with the agency. CIA Director Colby was quoted as saying, "Let's not pick on some poor reporters, for God's sake. Let's go to the management. They were witting." In all, about 25 organizations, including those listed at the beginning of this article, provided cover for the CIA. The CIA even ran a formal training program in the 1950s to teach its agents to be journalists. Intelligence officers were taught to make noise like reporters, explained a high CIA official, and were then placed in major news organizations with help from management. These were the guys who went through the ranks and were told, "You're going to be a journalist." It's worth noting that Anderson Cooper, the primetime anchor at CNN, worked for the CIA as an intern for 2 summers before abruptly quitting and decided he wanted to be a journalist. He would quickly rise up the ranks at CNN with no formal journalistic training and is the primetime anchor you see today. If this report teaches you anything, I hope it's that you can't take the media's word for it, that you have to do the research yourself, you have to go through the documents yourself. As for all my reports, everything referenced in this report is attached in the links below. I do suggest that you go through the information. It's also worth note that the results of the Church Committee, which came to be known as Operation Mockingbird, were the results of the attempted cover-up by the CIA. This is their way of mitigating damage. Imagine the scope of their actual infiltration into the media. And of course they said, as a result of the Church Committee, they were going to stop these practices. But a recently released document from the year 1984, you can't make that up, shows that, once again, that was just another government CIA lie. June 8th, 1984, Memorandum for Inspector General from the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. We have periodic sessions with college and university presidents, some of them undoubtedly with schools of journalism. Why miss the chance of putting our case in these forums as well? The result might well be a challenge to the practice of publishing indiscriminately whatever an investigative reporter can come up with. And given some curriculum changes, the next generation of reporters might show some elevation of ethics. The 1984 report would go on to describe truth-telling journalists as principal villains of the United States government and the CIA. It described a plan to infiltrate universities at the grassroots level to indoctrinate future journalists so that they would push government propaganda. That was 1984. Imagine the level of control the CIA has over the corporate mainstream media today. You are literally getting government propaganda no matter what station you put on. And you know this because look how threatened they are by truth-tellers. Across party lines, look how they talk about WikiLeaks. Look how they talk about Julian Assange, constantly talking of his imprisonment, of his assassination, telling you that you're not allowed to look at what they publish, because the entire corporate mainstream media is controlled. And in the rare instance that there's an actual truth-telling publication, the government, the corrupt government, is very threatened. Also understand that the CIA, the director of the CIA, is often appointed through the Council on Foreign Relations, or at least comes through the Council on Foreign Relations, an organization largely controlled by these tax-exempt foundations discussed earlier, the Rockefeller Foundation. I implore you, if you want to understand America, you have to do research into the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation. Understanding their activities will understand why society is always pushed toward socialism, toward collectivism, how it's indoctrinated into us at a university, really at a public school level, and then a university level, and it's indoctrinated into us by the corporate mainstream media, and through Hollywood, and through the social networks, which is also infiltrated by the CIA, the government, and these powerful tax-exempt foundations. It's why libertarian and conservative voices are constantly shut down on these social media platforms. Not because of hate, that's the cover they use. Because they don't want you to hear a message of small government and liberty. It's about power. I got into grassroots journalism because I understand the things that our government is doing. I see the direction they're driving our country, and it's a direction of debt slavery. It's a direction of complete power and control by a ruling class, an oligarchy who rules over the people. It is my life mission to expose these injustices, but I need your support. I need money to run my operation, to expand, to get better equipment, to produce better videos, to do journalism on the streets, and I can't do it without your support. For a subscription to my organization, For as little as $1 a month, you could help me change the world. Go to www.patreon.com, type in Tom Anderson, or click on the link below to my Patreon account, and help me change the world. Help me expose these injustices. Together, we can make the world a better place. We can make America a better place. We could spread liberty. We could spread freedom. And it will spread like wildfire throughout the world. I'm Tom Anderson, FFR News. Please subscribe and share this link on your social media.